My point is you have to save the outrage, genuinely outrageous things. Otherwise, we all get fed up with the outrage.
But we're comparing him to Hitler.
You know what it's like to go to sleep every night knowing you work for a bunch of psychotic killers?
So let me go ahead and eviscerate this mouth diarrhea for you sentence by sentence.
Get off my phone!
Decency. Decency. Decency.
Need a break from the shouting? You've just found it. A haven from the noise. A safe space for ideas that aren't welcome in safe spaces. A game of chess in a world of socio-political rugby. You're listening to The Right Moment.
Hey, what's up, America? This is Joel Curtinitis. You're listening to The Right Moment. What's going on? What are we talking about in America this week? Well, what maybe aren't we talking about and should be talking about? Those are usually the things that matter, right? Things that make the headlines every day. Sometimes they're really significant. Sometimes they impact everybody's lives. But a lot of times I feel like the things that we talk about, and especially the things that we get really angry about, are distractions in a way. From the things that we might not be looking at. A lot of times things that are a little more close to home. So a lot of interesting stuff to talk about this week. What I want to start out with is something that is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. Something that I have, an issue that I've grown up wrestling with forever, since I was a kid, actually. And I don't think there's a single bigger issue in America today, because this one does affect us all. This isn't one of those things that makes headlines for no reason. This is one that really determines who we are as a nation. So what I'm talking about is the issue of abortion. If you listen to this podcast, you're going to hear this brought up a lot. I'm passionate about defending life. I think that it's consistent with every the pro-life position is consistent with every civil rights movement in history, the cause of life and protecting the unborn, and not just the unborn, but predominantly because we're looking at a certifiable Holocaust, not only in America but globally in its scope. Abortion kind of immediately rises to the top of that list. So if you want to have a discussion about the death penalty or foreign wars or all sorts of other issues like that, police brutality, all of these things, I think can be pro-life issues, as well as adoption and how we care for children who are uncared for. All of those things can be pro-life issues, but there's one that immediately rises to the top just because of the scope of it. And so what I want to talk a little bit about abortion today. It's something that there was a specific set of cases that came up a couple of weeks ago, and I actually wrote an article in the Register about this. You can find that at the Des Moines Register, DesMoinesRegister.com. The title of the article was One Child's Death Mourned, Another Celebrated. And it's a really interesting dynamic that I felt like had to be put together. So the two stories that came out really a day apart. The first was the case of an illegal immigrant in Texas who was an expecting mother, 16 weeks pregnant, and a major court ruling to cut it to the chase. Basically, you can find the links in this in the article. But to cut to the chase, a district court ruling, or a circuit court ruling, said that the federal government in whose custody this young lady was had to facilitate her abortion immediately. And so these federal agents had to drive her in to get taken for an abortion, where she had her 16-week-old baby ripped up and surgically removed. And this was celebrated by people on the left. I mean, there were Hollywood actresses and bigwigs and public figures, as well as the ACLU and the usual suspects out there celebrating this as a win for civil rights, and it's a win for immigrants and all this stuff, which is just some irony in that, right? I mean, it's, hey, this poor scared immigrant girl who's in federal custody just got her baby cut up and sucked out of her. That's a real win for civil rights. It's a real win for immigrant rights. Little young immigrant in there, 50-50 chance whether it was a little boy or a little girl, not going to be born now. So that was the one story, and people were making a big deal about this on Twitter, especially. There's the hashtag Justice for Jane that got started. It was Jane Doe was the designation for the illegal immigrant in question. And it became a big thing. All these women out there shouting and Planned Parenthood celebrating, and oh, this is so wonderful that this scared illegal immigrant minor had to be taken in to get an abortion. And then the next day after that story came out, there was another story that was just, both these stories are just so heartbreaking, but the other one got a completely different reaction. So up here in Iowa, where I live, up in the northern part of the state, there was a couple who, the authorities got into their house and basically found their 4-month-old son dead and rotting in his baby swing. He had been there for at least a week. The coroner's report said unfed, uncared for, unwashed. This baby was just left alone in a room to suffer and die. And the parents apparently, for at least much of that time, were just a couple rooms away downstairs. And they let this young baby die and rot and have maggots growing on him. It was just a really sick, disgusting story from something that was perpetrated by sick and disgusting and immoral people. But I found the reactions to these stories really different. Of course, this one was a tragedy. It was a national tragedy. There was just mourning over this little baby, Sterling, who was neglected to death by his parents. I use that term loosely. But the reason that the reactions were so strikingly different, in my opinion, I just found so much oddness about the difference in reaction. I mean, look at this. You've got two cases where there's really not much difference in the victims, right? I mean, you're talking about a 4-month-old baby. A 4-month-old baby is dependent, as this case makes, right? I mean, everybody talks about the reason that abortion should be okay is that, well, the baby's not viable, the baby's dependent. I mean, once they're born, they're independent. But no, they're not. I have a 4-month-old right now. The story it was really personal to my wife and I, because we have a 4-month-old little boy and we love him to death. And just the thought of anyone doing this to their baby, it just fills me with rage, just fills me with fury. But when you examine this logically, if you take the emotion out of it, which is almost impossible to do in these kind of cases, but if you take the emotion out of it, there's just no difference. You're not going to find a difference. There's science will tell you that there's not much difference. It's just a different developmental stage. A 16-week-old unborn baby is developing a central nervous system. He or she has had a heartbeat for weeks and weeks by then. They've got their limbs, they've got their organs developing. I mean, this is a recognizable human baby. And when people say, well, no, it's a fetus. Okay, but a fetus is just a stage of human development, right? It's not like it's a different thing. It's not like it's a zebra and then it's born and then it's a human being. I mean, this is still a human being that we're talking about. If you're talking about a fetus, that's a stage of human being. Baby is another stage. Teenager is another stage. So kind of a less than desirable stage most of the time, but I digress. The question has to come up when you're comparing these two things. Why do we mourn? What are people mourning for when this 4-month-old was neglected to death by his parents? And by the way, the parents just denied resources. They didn't go in there and hack him up with a machete, which is what happened essentially to the 16-week-old that was killed in utero. I mean, this was just neglect. Hey, we don't want to give him our resources anymore. We have a right to choose, right? Didn't those parents have a right to choose whether to share shelter and food and critical care with little Sterling? Like, was there no right to choose for them? Why is nobody celebrating their right to choose? No, because it's a baby, right? The whole argument comes down to if it's an innocent human child that we're talking about, then none of the circumstances matter. It doesn't matter at all. Nothing matters. It doesn't matter if you're impoverished. It doesn't matter whether that child presents a hardship to you. It doesn't matter whether you're uneducated or your life will be harder or their life will be hard. None of that matters. Nobody justifies starving a 4-month-old to death. But somehow it becomes really ambiguous when you're talking about a 16-week-old or even a 20-week-old baby in some states when these laws have been passed, barring abortion at 20 weeks. These arguments come up. Well, the baby is not viable and, there should be a right to choose, because what if this baby presents an economic burden on the parents? I mean, it could just derail their whole life. Okay, but guess what? So does an infant. If you're talking about the potential ramifications of that, then there's no difference. So if we're going to mourn a 4-month-old baby that had his life taken from him, and in a horrible, horrific way, why don't we mourn for the 16-week-old? Why not? Why does nobody care? Why are we celebrating that one as a right to choose? Now, this was not a chemical abortion. This is a surgical abortion, 16 weeks. They have to go in there, and there's many descriptions of this online, but they have to go in with surgical instruments and pull the baby apart and then remove it from the womb. It's an awful, awful, hideous, painful procedure. And this is the type of thing that is celebrated on the left. So look, if we mourn for a baby's potential, if we mourn for, oh, there was a potential life ahead of them, look at what they could have contributed, look at what they could have done, then really there's no more reason to mourn one than the other, right? I mean, there might be a potential there might not be. That infant might not have done anything with his life. He might have grown up to be a deadbeat or a homeless guy or whatever. So if you're mourning those things, then you really can't condemn the parents in either case, because, hey, they're expendable. If they are good for my life, then I'll keep them. If they're not, then I won't. But if we're mourning for something deeper, if we're mourning for lost humanity, for a violation of the rights of that infant and the inherent worth and dignity of his life as a human being, and that, that doesn't matter. The accomplishment has nothing to do with that. There's dignity and rights that we have as human beings, whether you're Bill Gates or the homeless guy down the street, it doesn't matter. And if that's why we're mourning, because those rights were violated, then we have to mourn for the 16-week-old as well, because that was a human being developing. That was a developing human being. That was a person. And when you violate those rights, you have violated the dignity of us all. It's an issue that's going to keep coming up, because it needs to end. People are waking up and seeing the light. They're getting behind and around the euphemisms that the abortion lobby has dropped on us for years and years and years. Look, this isn't a religious thing for me in any way. There's no, people want to talk about, you're trying to impose your religion. It has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with biology. I mean, you grow up, basic biology is going to show you that human life starts at conception. It's just that simple. There's a number of science textbooks that will show you this, and it's something that's not disputed in any other capacity. I mean, when we talk about baby animals, nobody talks about, well, it's not a baby animal, it's just a little clump of cells in there until it's born. No, there's puppies, right? They're puppies. Whether they're born or whether they're not born, they're puppies. We know this. This is science. So, and the abortion lobbies, they're losing ground on this quickly. And honestly, it's only in part due to the pro-life movement, which is gaining strength and is actually gaining tremendous strength among millennials and younger Americans. I think the more immediate cause of the recent shift towards being pro-life is just medical technology has just come that far. I mean, when my wife and I were having both of our children, we tracked every week of their development. We would go online and look excitedly at all the articles about, hey, this is week 4. Here's what's developing. Here's what your baby's doing this week. It's week 10. Here's what your baby's doing. It's week 8. Here they have a heartbeat and it's getting stronger. And here's week 15. Here's what they're doing. Here's week 20 and their nervous system is developing. And here's week 24 and they can hear you talking. I mean, it's amazing. We know so much more now about this miracle of life and how it develops and what happens at each stage. And as you do that, it becomes impossible for the abortion lobby to point at any given point and say, okay, that's when it's okay to kill a baby. I mean, right now it's legal in some states, at least still, where restrictions have not been passed to kill a developing baby all the way up to the moment of birth. So you decide you want to have a baby, go for it. If you change your mind in the hospital, it's still legal for you to kill the baby. Well, that's something that even the rest of the civilized world is rejecting at this point. It's clear that the baby has rights. But the problem for abortionists is if they sacrifice that as their moral premise, where do they go next? Well, I mean, where do you fall back to? Well, okay, it's not okay to kill a baby at 40 weeks, but it's okay at 30. Well, not really. I mean, there's very little difference. Biologically, there's no difference. They're both developing. Neither of them are finished developing. It's not like, the toast is done. It's going to pop out of the toaster now. I mean, it's they're going to continue developing, and just as the infant did. So there's no difference there. You want to go back to 20 weeks. Okay, well, 20 weeks is where most of the fetal pain bills fall, because it's been established. Actually, it's been pretty well established in a study or two that pain can be established. Pain can be felt by a fetus much earlier than 20 weeks, but 20 at this point is pretty well universally accepted. So is it okay to kill them after 20 weeks? Why? I mean, why should I be able to go rip limbs off of a developing baby at 20 weeks when they can feel that and experience it? What about before that? Where do you draw the line? At the brain activity? Why? If you make the line brain activity, then can we go shoot people in comas? I mean, that doesn't make any sense, does it? And so again, this isn't a religious issue at all. It's a scientific issue. It's a logical consistency issue. You have to be logically consistent. And if you can't draw that line when it's okay to kill an innocent person, then just you have to set that line at the beginning and say it's a person. There's no confusing all of these euphemisms and it's a woman can do what she wants with her body. It's not her body. You know what your body has? You know what every single cell in your body has? Your DNA. You know what the fetus from a couple maybe an hour, a matter of hours after conception does not have your DNA. Doesn't have your partner's DNA. That young human being has its own DNA. It's not yours. When blood starts developing, it might not even share your blood type. That's not your body. And if you want to talk about, well, okay, but I have a right to say what's in my body. Well, you did have that right, and you had sex, and you put something in your body. The baby didn't choose to be there. You made that choice. And when people talk about, well, a woman has the right to choose. Yes, she does. Men and women all have the right to choose. And you make that choice when you have sex. After that, you don't have a choice. You have consequences of your choice. And that's what this is about. They're not trying to have choice. They're trying to get out of the consequences of choice. And look, if you want to make the case that you shouldn't have consequences for your choice, fine. Okay? You want to get rid of the consequences? You want to get rid of the baby? Fine. But then don't lecture me about why it's immoral to kill a 4-month-old, because that's all they were doing. They were getting rid of the consequences of their choice. And it's what evil people do. It's what wicked people do. It's what illogical, unfounded people do. And it's not something we can allow to continue as a society. So give that some thought. We'll talk about that. I'm sure many other episodes coming up. It's something that I'm very passionate about. But you know what? Hang on, because we've got more coming for you. You're listening to The Right Moment. Welcome back to The Right Moment. I am your host, Federalist and homeschool paladin Joel Curtinitis. Let's talk about healthcare, shall we? I mean, that sort of seems to have dropped out of the public consciousness for a little bit here, but hey, Obamacare is still in place. It's not being repealed anytime soon from the look of things in Congress. Heck, we might not even get a tax cut at this rate. But there are some innovations that are going on in healthcare that really are not getting talked about enough. You know, I started out the program today saying, what are the things we should be discussing and aren't as a nation? Well, there's a couple of those things in healthcare that, you know, they've made headlines occasionally over the last couple of years, but people either don't find out about them or they forget about them, and they just sort of exit the discussion, and they keep running in the background. But I think that these two healthcare innovations that I'm going to bring up today have been running in the background long enough and successfully enough that they are, I believe, the next step in the American healthcare system, no matter what happens in Congress or what doesn't happen in Congress. There's always this two-pronged approach to advancing civilization, right? I mean, we want to stay involved in government. We want to make sure that we don't turn into a tyranny, that people's rights are protected, all of those things. But most of the advances that civilization sees are not because of government. They're because of the private sector. They're because people are innovating and people are trying to make better lives for themselves in any way possible. Well, that's what's happening in healthcare too. The government has destroyed our healthcare system, and they're not alone in that blame. Now, granted, there's some corporate corruption that goes along with that, and there's plenty of blame to go around. But rather than assigning blame, let's start looking for solutions. And I think that, you know, we're in the information age, we're in the technology age. There's so many solutions that we can apply to healthcare. There's no reason that it should be as out of control as it is. Well, so there's two different trends. One of them is domestic. One of them is, unfortunately for the moment, foreign. But both of them, I believe, will fundamentally transform the scope of American healthcare, not just American, but global healthcare in the years to come. So the first of those two is the domestic trend. And that's a really interesting domestic trend that I've been following for a little while now. And it's a trend towards cash-only primary care providers. It's really interesting. It's been running for a while now. There was a fairly high-profile Time article that came out earlier this year called What Happens When Doctors Only Take Cash. This was published on January 26th of this year. And, 2017, I guess. If it's a podcast, I probably ought to mention the year, just in case, you want to go all Indiana Jones and dig this up in 50 years. Then you'll get to see how right I was. So, no, so there's a trend that's going on, basically, as the insurance system is collapsing here. And by the way, I refuse to say that's only due to Obamacare. Our insurance system was in trouble long before that. And honestly, the health insurance system in the United States, I think, has long outlived its usefulness. But the long story short is that doctors are finding that as they get away from the ridiculous burden of health insurance and Medicare and Medicaid and reimbursements, all of those things that require so much paperwork and so much overhead, that they're able to have better practices, accomplish things more quickly, spend more time with their patients, do better work, and have better practices overall when they only take cash. Some of these places do memberships that you purchase a membership to your primary healthcare provider. And at this point, obviously, we're not talking about giant, emergency room structures. We're talking about primary physicians and care providers. But it's gotten to the point where some of these folks have, by their own accounts, cut their overhead by 40 to 50%, which is huge. You want to talk about affordable healthcare? Well, let's cut off half of the paperwork and overhead and staffing requirements, and that'll drop your cost quite a bit. So they're seeing tremendous reductions in that, and they're also, because they're not eaten up so much with not only regulations and paperwork, but just the demand to see so many patients to cover those high overhead costs. They have to cram people through as quickly as possible. You don't have to do that in a membership environment or in a cash only environment. Your margins are different. Some of them actually make house calls again. I mean, how long has it been since you heard of anyone making a house call as a doctor? So it's really opening up possibilities in the U.S. healthcare market that haven't been around for a while. And I really can't help but think that this is going to upend the current healthcare structure in the United States. I mean, how could it not? You have a tension going on right now between confused conservative Republican types who are like, well, we don't want to sound mean and get rid of Medicare and Medicaid and Obamacare. But people have to have health insurance because how can we get out on the stage during election cycles and tell people we're going to take away your health insurance? And then you've got the, Bernie Sanders socialists on the other side saying, well, we need to just go ahead and sink the whole system and go to full, go full Bolshevik and just have socialized healthcare. Okay, well, neither one of those is a workable solution. But meanwhile, while they're arguing about this, and this is one of the things I love about gridlocked government, whether it's a divided government or whether it's a government where one party is in power but is gutless and spineless and can't get anything done. Not to put too fine a point on it. But one of the things I love about a divided government in either of those circumstances is that the more government drags its feet on things like healthcare, the more the market finds a way around it. The more these, regulations and things become irrelevant because people just figure out better ways and they get around the barricades that you've put in front of them. And that's what's going on with these cash only practices. They're finding out, hey, you know what? The price of healthcare has gone through the roof. The price of everything that's subsidized by government goes through the roof. Wonder if there's a, correlation there. Meanwhile, the price of cars, computers, iPads, everything else is coming down. Well, why are commodity prices coming down, even for complex consumer electronics? But the prices for healthcare and medical technology, which much of which we've had for ages, not all of it, obviously, there's some new technology that's come into play, but a lot of this is normal, everyday, splint your broken bone kind of stuff. Why are the prices for that skyrocketing so much? Okay, so maybe we ought to look at commoditizing it, because if you stop treating healthcare like a right and start treating it like a commodity, guess what? It's cheap. It's affordable. People can afford it. And the way that we can actually show that is by looking at the second trend that's going on with healthcare, and that's a global trend. Started in India, believe it or not. Real interesting story that I've been following again for quite a while here. This is not a new story. There was a reference that I first saw in July of 2013. Saw a headline that you really can't look past. This is 2013, so it's during Obamacare implementation, and we're all worrying about what's going to happen with that. There's a Bloomberg article that came out that said the headline was "Heart Surgery in India for 1583 costs $106,000 in the U.S." That's a bit of a difference. Basically the idea is this: there's a Devi Shetty who is let me see if I can find his exact title here. I guess he's world internationally renowned Indian cardiac surgeon, but he's also the CEO or the head of Narayana Healthcare. This is an operation that he's had. This was apparently a really interesting story. Devi Shetty was actually Mother Teresa's physician for 5 years. And really interesting. Apparently, she pleaded with him to bring life-saving healthcare to India's poorest people, and he undertook that as a bit of a mission. And so, what he's done is he has developed. He's basically applied the dynamics of mass construction and mass production to healthcare in India. And so now, heart bypass surgery in the United States costs over $100,000 at Narayana's hospitals in India. According to inside sources in September this year, actually. But at Narayana's hospitals, the cost is in the $1,000 to $2,000 range. So think about that. That you want to talk about affordable healthcare. Okay, take an operation that costs $100,000. And this is not a small, we're not talking about primary care anymore here. We're talking about major surgery. And you cut that cost from $100,000 to $1,000. And he's done this by just making everything efficient. He's going lean. He's having a smaller administrative and management structure. And by the way, he's internationally accredited. All these health centers, they're not dirt floors and flies coming in the windows. These are professional medical centers that are up to the standards of the West. So there is innovation that's going on from his side of things, and he's actually frustrated. There's a number of articles that you'll find. He opened up a medical healthcare center doing these high volume heart surgeries in the Cayman Islands, just off the coast of the United States. And his frustration is palpable in his statements and in his quotes that he has to even do that. He has to stay off the shores of the United States where healthcare costs have exploded and we have a healthcare crisis on our hands. Because of the regulatory structure that's so ridiculous here. Now, this is a quote from Shetty in this article that I'm looking at. He says, by building such a healthcare institution in a British protectorate right outside the U.S. regulatory structure, Cayman Islands, which can work with U.S. doctors and experts for the U.S. patients, one can show that it is possible in healthcare, even in the developed world, and at what cost, to make things cheaper and more affordable. So it's just insane to me that we're seeing this kind of innovation, but the politicians, the bureaucrats who are so invested and so passionate about making healthcare affordable. We have a right to healthcare, all this screaming going on. But guess what? We have healthcare innovations and tremendous price reductions, life-saving procedures going on right off of our shore in the Cayman Islands, and we can't bring them in state. We can't bring them in. Because they don't match up to our regulatory structure, which, by the way, much of which is so far obsolete, it's embarrassing. But we're shooting ourselves in the foot to spite our headache with this. I mean, this is the kind of innovation that we need to be embracing. Does anyone think that American doctors can't do the same thing? Does anyone think that our healthcare providers here can't do the same thing and even better? Well, of course we can. Just give people the right. Let them have the freedom to go out and try new things. That's the kind of market driver that makes regulations irrelevant. Because you know what? Minimum regulations are there to make things regular. Do you ever think about that? They're there to make things regular. They don't make things exceptional. They don't make things innovative. They don't make things smart. They just make them regular. So if you want to improve processes, if you want to do things better, if you want to do something revolutionary, if you want to make something better, faster, cheaper, regulations will never, ever, 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 ever do it. That's not what they're there for. That's not their purpose at all. They're there to make things regular. So you establish one thing and you say, man, that's good enough. Let's make everything like that. That's literally their purpose. It's in the word. So when you have innovations like this, we really can't be too surprised when government shuts them down. You really can't be surprised when people ignore them and say, well, that's outside our regulations. Well, of course it is, because your regulations are making it look like something that's terrible. And we don't want to be like something that's terrible. We want to be better. If you face the same thing on a regular basis, people just don't think about it. I just finished remodeling our house, and I had to go through a number of regulations and just terrible, awful, counterintuitive things that have nothing to do with safety or stability or engineering. None of those things. It just has to do with, we want to put something in place that makes sure that nobody ever can do something really stupid. Okay, but as you do that, you're also eliminating the possibility for something to do something very smart, very helpful, very good, because they don't have the right to try. Nobody will ever know. So it's the same thing applied to healthcare. It's costing us. The longer we wait to embrace this kind of innovation and really try out this kind of new forefront of medical technology and of business technology. Honestly, this is a business innovation as well as a medical innovation. But the longer we wait to embrace that, the more people are going to suffer. People are losing their insurance. People are losing their jobs. People are losing their savings over this. And, if it's not happening yet, it's going to happen soon. People are going to lose their lives. So there's a high impact to this. But you know what? Government's not going to solve the problem. They've had decades and decades and decades to do it, and all they've done is make it worse. And again, this is not a specific critique of Obamacare. Obamacare is a massive failure. But our healthcare was a shambles before that. And most doctors that you talk to will tell you Obamacare did not start the problem. That's not the first problem the American healthcare system had or the American health insurance system had. We had problems before that. So it could be that the hardship that we faced in this is actually driving us to solutions that are better, driving us to a better future. And that's part of what I want to focus on here. I want to focus on not only the things that are going poorly and the political problems that we're creating, but how they're driving us to be better. How things are going better, how the millennial generation and the generation after us is innovating to get around those things, to do things better, faster, smarter. I mean, the pace of innovation in the United States right now is just unbelievable. I mean, we're shattering business models and health models and all kinds of cultural norms to be able to break into things that are better. To be able to develop things that are new and ideas that nobody thought of before. And we're reducing them all to the size of an app that fits on a phone in your pocket. And I think that's something that should be extremely relevant to all sort of political and social discussions. It's not just what's wrong. It needs to be about how can we make this better? What can we do better? What can we do faster? What can we do in a way that's more efficient so that we can raise more people out of poverty, so that we can have a society where people are reasonable and honest and fair with each other, where we're not so polarized that we have to scream everything we say. We can find ways to do this. We're going to have to do it together. And we're going to have to embrace innovation, and we're going to have to embrace some change, even though it's uncomfortable. That's all we've got for this week. Make sure you tune in next week. We're going to have a lot more coming up for you. There's tons of new developments that I didn't even get to this time. But you know what? We're going to have a lot more to talk about, and we're going to have a good time. Hey, I'm Joel Kurtnitis, and if you were waiting for the right moment, that was it.